So without more ado, I'd like to pass over to Professor John Hanley to tell us more about our guest speaker.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be introducing Paul Nolan, tonight's speaker. Recently, the government has woken up to the importance of trees and tree planting for human well-being, for combating climate change, and even as a contribution to combating the crisis of biodiversity. But back in 1990, around the time of the Earth Summit, the Countryside Commission launched an exciting initiative. It was the idea of creating connected woodland networks around the fringes of our towns and cities and engaging people in that process. So the whole thing was going to be not some sort of remote forest way out of town, but it was going to be right on our doorstep, and even coming into the urban forest, even into the heart of our towns and cities, creating these woodland networks. And I was one of a group of people who got together to think about what a community forest for Merseyside might be like. And we conceived of a forest within a triangle formed by the pine woodlands of Formby in the north, Delamere Forest in the south, and the woodlands of Warrington Newtown around Birchwood in the east. And that was an area of about 500 square miles. It was much the most ambitious of the community forest proposals, but it was accepted by the Countryside Commission. And it has proved to be the most enduring and the most influential. And both of those attributes are really down to Paul Nolan, our speaker this evening. Paul joined the Mersey Forest was established in 1991. Paul joined it in 1994, and he became its director in 2001. He is a master of partnership working. He believes in having a very small team which punches way above its weight by working with others to get them to share that community forestry agenda, and then helping to deliver the Mersey Forest objectives. And by 2014, the Mersey Forest had already planted more than 9 million trees. And Paul was awarded an OBE in the Queen's Queen's Birthday Honours List in June 2014 for services to forestry. In the last year or so, Cheshire East Council has become a formal partner of the Mersey Forest, and we thought it would be really very timely and informative to get Paul to tell us something about the work of his group and the way it is contributing to the development of a Northern Forest Initiative, which is going all the way from the Irish Sea to the North Sea. And Cheshire East was an important gap in that network. So looking forward enormously to hearing what Paul has to say. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thank you for that introduction. And I should also say, yeah, John, as he pointed out, was instrumental in creating the idea of Mersey Forest, and I'll talk about us refreshing our forest plan later in my presentation. But John, I think, is very kindly going to be on the group that's looking at our plan, nearly 30 years on from that initial idea of, what could a community forest look like. So it's really interesting to get those sorts of long-term perspectives on planning in particular. So I'm going to start to share my screen, if that's okay.
Thank you, that's good. Astrid, can you mute, please?
Does that come through okay?
Yes, excellent, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to touch on all the things that that John's described, and again, John, thank you for that introduction. Definitely, everything that happens in Mersey Forest is to do with lots of people going way above and beyond expectations to try to make things happen. So it's definitely a team endeavour for sure. One of the things that I think we are turning our attention to as we develop our plans for the future is how do we get more people-powered planting, and I will talk about what on earth that might mean in the future slides as well. So just a bit of background. So John spoke a little bit about this. So Mersey Forest is a place. So one of the important considerations about community forests is they are designated areas of the country. So it's not a movement, it's not just an idea, there are administrative boundaries to the Mersey Forest. The local authority partners who you see here by and large have signed up to a partnership agreement. The only two who haven't are Warrington and Horton. They dropped out a few years ago from the formal partnership due to budgetary constraints. But in the last 2 years, as John has pointed out, we were joined by Cheshire East and by the Wirral. Wirral was always strangely left off the forest plan for nearly 25, 26 years. For reasons that probably John knows better than I, because I think he was probably involved in some of those conversations right at the start of the Mersey Forest being created, and why Wirral didn't jump on board all those years ago. So having worked covertly on the Wirral for a good 20 years, they are now fully embracing of the idea of Mersey Forest and are a really key partner in Mersey Forest. Cheshire East, again, we're really delighted that Cheshire East are involved. Last year, Cheshire East were the most prolific tree planter of all of the local authorities in the community forests. So they came number one. They just pipped Cheshire West at the post, to Cheshire East's great delight and to Cheshire West's consternation, as you can well imagine. So a scheme dropped out at the last minute in Cheshire West, and that meant that Cheshire East just pipped. But what that does show, I think, is the level of activity going on in Mersey Forest. So the fact that Cheshire East were number one, Cheshire West were number two in the country for tree planting in local authority areas, just shows the scale of effort that's going on in Cheshire at the moment to try to plant trees to help us to mitigate and adapt to climate change, but also to create better connected habitats for the landscape and for nature, again, as John pointed out. So Mersey Forest is a place, a definite place with a boundary, and within that place we have a plan. So the Mersey Forest plan sets out our long-term objectives, what we want to do, how we want to do it, where we want to do it, and why as well. So we have 10 reasons, if you like, for planting trees, and our strapline "More from Trees" really guides what we try to do. So whilst we all do love trees, of course, the reason the reason for planting our woodlands has to be purposeful. So we're looking at obviously mitigation, adaptation to climate change, biodiversity improvement, enhancement. But we're also looking at jobs. We're looking at setting the scene for growth, so creating attractive places for businesses to invest in. I'll maybe come back to that one in a moment. We're also looking at creating places where children can play, place for natural play, outdoor learning, and a whole host of other things, including improving our health and well-being, which has been absolutely critical over the past 2.5 years, as we've been a year ago or so stuck indoors, using our green spaces much more than we maybe did in the past. To mention it, I mentioned setting the scene for growth, so creating attractive places for investment. So a place very dear to John's heart, I know, is St Helens and the Bold Forest Park area of St Helens, which formerly consisted of a number of disused, well, probably relatively recently, as well as more longer-term disused sites from the colliery industry, coal mining industry. Those sites are now woodlands, and a meeting last week we understood with the combined authority for Merseyside and St Helens went round, and they were surprised, because these people probably don't look at these sites very often, surprised just how green this part of St Helens now is. And John can probably describe to you how probably in the early days of groundwork it wasn't a green place and it wasn't an attractive place, and the local authority really were challenged to bring investors into those places because they couldn't show a green and pleasant land to bring new business. Whereas now people are saying, you know, we're surprised at this jewel in the crown, if you like, this green jewel in the crown. And that hasn't happened by accident. It's happened because the Netherlands joined the Mersey Forest a long time ago. They were one of the key partners, and they stuck with a plan for a long period of time. And the message about how we get things done is definitely about teamwork. It's definitely about collaboration. It's definitely about looking to see who can do what best. But it's also about time. Too often, many of our projects and programs that we look to fund have to, as necessity, because of the way funding works, be short term. And the beauty of the Mersey Forest is that somehow we've managed to jump from government to government, from funding regime to funding regime, and stick with a plan. And that's really important for us. The original, this version of the forest plan you can see on screen here is our third version. So we're just refreshing this for our fourth version, which will be published in 2025. But if you look at the core concepts in this plan and then reflect back on the original plan, they're very similar. The words might be slightly different. So back in the original plan, we would use global warming. Now, obviously, the more nuanced terms around climate adaptation and mitigation, but the idea is the same. The idea of setting the scene for growth, you know, creating attractive places, the idea of engaging people, they've been a golden thread throughout the Mersey Forest for the past 30 years. And we think it's going to be a golden thread which will stretch for the next 30 years as well. So we'll be refreshing our forest plan over the next couple of years. We would love this group to be part of the conversation about that. John's definitely going to be in the heart and centre of those conversations. So maybe he can be our contact with this group for that process of plan development. So that's our plan. And the way we work is to try to gather resources, gain resources, funding to implement this plan. So at the moment, as John has mentioned already, we have two major projects, one called Northern Forest, and that is a collaboration between 4 community forests across the M62 corridor, or the Transpennine Trail corridor, as I ought to call it. And that's Mersey Forest, City of Trees in Manchester, White Rose Forest, which covers Yorkshire, and the Humber Forest, which is on Round Hull and North Lincolnshire. So those 4 community forests plus the Woodland Trust are all working together to try to increase woodland cover. Our aim is 50 million trees over the next 25 years, and we've got backing from government to help us to do that, in conjunction with an even larger programme called Trees for Climate. And this is a total of £170 million being delivered through the community forests. £20 million of that is nominally directed at Mersey Forest for us to plant around about 900 hectares of new woodland over the next 5 years or so. So we've already done a couple of years, so we've got another 3 or 4 years to go to get up to 900. It's a massive task. You know, government has asked a lot of all of the woodland creation partnerships to accelerate woodland planting. But as you've heard, Cheshire East, Cheshire West, the other Mersey Forest authorities, private landowners are definitely gearing up and getting more trees in the ground. Probably more trees being planted at the moment than any time for the past 20 years. So that is good news. But we've still got to do a huge amount more, which is where the people-powered planting might come in. We've got resources, and these are the sorts of things we can support. So we're really quite I suppose flexible, one might say, in what we can support. So we obviously can do the usual multi-purpose woodland, so greater than 5 hectares, all those sorts of things. But we go all the way down to hedgerow trees, even individual trees outside houses, etc. And we also support natural colonisation as well. So we are very keen to see, I suppose, what some people might call rewilding, particularly along riparian areas across Mersey Forest. So we'll work with any landowner, doesn't matter how big, how small, public sector, private sector, industrial or not, to try to get one version of this woodland type created on their land, with all sorts of scales, all sorts of opportunities to incorporate trees and woodlands into their land holding, and to join up across landscape as well. So using that forest plan to direct where trees go, and to show how things are gradually coalescing and forming really quite important and intricate networks across Mersey Forest. So we also use Liverpool John Moores University at the moment to assess all of this work and to show the what we term the natural capital benefits of all of this work. So what is the increase in biodiversity projected through this planting? What is the landscape improvement? What is the amount of flood risk reduction that might occur as a result of all this planting, etc. So we try to look at the wider benefits, going all the way back to the idea about the Mersey Forest is about more from trees, not just sticking trees in the ground. Even if we do like trees, there's got to be a purpose for them. This idea of people-powered planting is something that's really, really raw. So you're being tested out on this, to be honest. So I'm being very, very open with you, because I think we want to move forward and see how we get many, many more people involved in what lots of people say is the biggest issue that we face as a world, I suppose. How do we tackle climate change? And sometimes it can seem overwhelming, and lots of what we do might seem just useless in the face of the global climate. So what can we do? And is part of what Mersey Forest does a way of providing a small drop of hope about us being able to do something? So I'll touch on some of the things that we're thinking about. I'd really welcome your ideas on whether these are good, bad, or indifferent ways to try to get many more people powered to plant more trees across Mersey Forest and maybe beyond. So the first one, seed gathering, which again is nothing very, very new, but something we traditionally have only, I suppose, done in a very, very minor way to engage some communities in planting some trees. But supposing we were to try to get many more people involved over a longer period of time, supposing we were just to get 1% of the population growing 1 acorn on their windowsill every year, and supposing only half of those acorns survive, over the next 10 years, that would lead, and we planted those trees out with communities planting, we'd have 500 hectares of new woodland created over the next 10 years, 50 hectares a year, completely done by communities. And what if it were 2? And supposing more survived, and supposing lots of supposes. So we're thinking people-powered planting, starting with seed gathering, could actually be really powerful. It could lead to many more people thinking they've got some agency in trying to do something around climate adaptation and mitigation. Certainly provides much more of a social element to creating a community forest. And is that something we can develop over a long period of time with many groups, maybe coordinated by groups like yours, or supported by groups like yours, or encouraged by groups like yours to get involved and stay involved over a long period of time. The Tree Council have run seed gathering season for a long time, and anything we do, we always look back to the Tree Council and use the resources that they have and credit them for the national profile that they give this sort of thing. And how would we develop a longer term plan for this? So we are going to do a push this year on seed gathering because it is a mast year. So you'll have noticed probably as you've been walking around, there are loads of acorns on the trees. There's lots of beech mast, and other trees have also got lots of seed this year. So it seems like it's a really good year to go and encourage people to get an acorn, stick it in a yogurt pot, grow it on the windowsill over the winter, and then get out and plant it in one of the sites that we'll have available next year. But who would help, and how do we sustain that interest, and how do we recognise those people who might be powering the planting over the long term as well? So this idea that the landscape changes because people change it, we think could be quite powerful, but we'd want some way to recognise those who've actually contributed to the change. So I'll come back. There's some questions for you for later, maybe. But the second one about people-powered planting, Arbor Day in the UK. So Arbor Day is definitely a US thing. It started off in the US and has spread around the world, but hasn't really taken off in the UK to any great degree. We worked with Arbor Day Foundation. They support some of what we do by providing $1 a tree for some of the planting that we do. But what we'd like to see is whether we can encourage Arbor Day to be an end of planting season celebration. So we have National Tree Week, which for us kicks off the planting season, even if we've done a little bit of planting before National Tree Week. Most of our comms around what we're going to do in 22-23 will come at the end of November in National Tree Week. But we don't really have anything at the other end of the season to say, look what you all did, and to celebrate all that planting. mostly because most people are kind of exhausted by the end of the planting season, probably just want to go and have a break. But maybe we just have one final push to say, well done and thank you to everybody, and encourage them to get ready for next season as well. So we're looking to see whether Arbor Day would be keen to do this sort of thing. We've been promoting a low-key version of this at the moment with Myerscough College, but they tend to have their event in February to coincide with their Careers Day. So it doesn't quite do what we wanted to do in that sort of end of season celebration. This idea again, for welcome your comments on, would communities want to celebrate trees planted, or that they plan to plant as well? So is there also something about encouraging people to look ahead? And then the third one is about young people planning as well as planting. So we do lots of work with schools, and again, as John knows, and some of you know really well, and we have done lots of work with schools to create new woodlands, to create areas for learning, to provide better play experience for children as well. So separating what we call fast play and quieter play, so that those who want to play football have their area, that the children who probably want to be a bit quieter have their area maybe in a wooded setting. So that's gone really well. We do forest school, we do lots of other learning. We train teachers to teach natural curriculum in the outdoors. When I say we supported Liverpool John Moores University to teach teachers how to teach in the outdoors as well. But we don't really, I don't think, capture the voice of children well in our plans. So as we're writing our New Forest plan, and Dr. Susanna Gill, who was one of John's students back at University of Manchester, who now works for Mersey Forest, she's writing the plan, and she's really keen to see how we get the voice of young people heard in our New Forest plan as we refresh it. So again, really interested in whether you think that's a good idea, and how do we allow the plan to evolve to include new voices over time as well. And that might be young people, it might be young people as become older people, and it might be not so young people as they get older too. So how do we continue to hear what people need to say about how the Mersey Forest evolves over time? And then the last one, which might be a bit soft, but I'm really interested in this idea of the forest being about hope. This idea that tackling climate change can seem hopeless, acknowledging that tree planting is not the answer, but all routes to net zero include tree planting. It's one of the few low-cost, net negative ways of tackling climate change. So the fact that trees suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and lock it up in wood, but in many ways buys us time for other technologies or other ways to use less fossil fuel to come into play to allow us to hit net zero before we before even more damaging temperature increase that happens. So tree planting is one action among many. It is funded and it's relatively easy to do, and it's necessary, and we can all do it. So it's something everybody can take part in or support or enable. And people-powered planting is something we can all do. And do we start to push this idea that it provides hope? And whilst hope isn't a strategy, it's a pretty good tactic, one would argue. But we also need to be realistic. So how do we balance hope and realism? So we can't solve all the problems. And how do we get this message of hope across in a world that is polarized, increasingly polarized? Because our discussion about where we need trees, how we need trees, what we need to do is actually quite a nuanced discussion about the need and how trees are net negative is quite a nuanced discussion as well. So getting all of that out there, this message of hope is going to be a challenge, which again, I'd welcome your views on. And that is my canter through Mersey Forest with lots of questions for you. So thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you this evening. It's always a pleasure to talk to this group and to talk to the people of Wilmslow about your plans for tree planting as well.
Well, that's super, Paul. Thank you very much. If you'd like to close your screen, then if we want, with so few people, we can have most people seeing each other, which would be lovely. And we've got a couple of questions from Pauline on chat. One's a statement and another question. But the offer of help you've already got from the WI. Pauline's very often stepping forward as a leader in the WI, and that's a marvellous offer. So don't forget that one. That's a take home for you from this evening, Paul, straight away. And Pauline asks, where do we plant the baby trees? So we've all got our baby trees. How, when, and where? Who's going to coordinate? Who's going to call us in to the
so that's so as I said, this is early days, so this hasn't all been thought through to the nth degree. So yeah, we are going to plant about 900 hectares over the next few years. So next year we'll plant around about 200 hectares. So we will have a series of community events solely dedicated to weekends or a few weekends of activity where people bring their tree or trees that they've grown on their windowsill, or school groups who've grown them in their classrooms, to have a focused community planting events across Mersey Forest. So probably 1 or 2 sites in each local authority. Sites still to be confirmed, because we're at least 15 months away from those sites needing to be planted.
That's super. Oh, to be young again. I used to love the school competitions, and the chart that had the stars on. Plant an oak tree and you get your star, and then when it reaches 5 inches or whatever, sorry, centimeters, you get your next star. All very incentivized, I'm sure.
So can I add a supplementary to this? This is all very encouraging and very exciting about the ability to go along and take your tree and plant it, but it sounds a bit impractical to have one person, one tree all on the same day. It would be absolutely, well, very difficult. So how would we as a WI, because I'm a WI climate ambassador and I can link in with the climate ambassadors on this, how would I pass the message around about what was going to happen? Have you got any rough plans about how it would actually happen?
As I said, so we do these sorts of things already, but what would normally happen would be people turn up and we give them trees. So we would have bought in trees, and then groups come along. We're a bit like you've done this evening. We use an online booking system. So people say, I'm going to bring my tree, or I'm going to turn up at site X on day Y, and I'm going to bring my 3 children or whatever. So people book on. So it is organised. So we can, we're not faced with 5,000 cars sat outside a 1 hectare site in the middle of Cheshire East, because no one would thank us for that. So we would basically have event organisation around each site, so that all the things around parking, loos, the booking on of people, when people are coming, are they the right numbers? Are they bringing the right number of trees? Can they, most of all, do they have a good time? So they've taken the time to grow a tree. They've looked after it for a year. They want to feel special when they come along on that day. That's our priority. This isn't a mass. It's not an industrialized tree planting activity. It's got, the event on the day has got to be about the people, making sure they go away thinking that they've done some good.
Paul, how can I link in with you to get this link to be told and alerted when this is going to happen? Because you've got to find the people somehow and link them in with you, haven't you?
Yeah. So we're doing we're going to do a soft launch. Probably it was going to be this week. It's been delayed now, obviously, but so we're going to do some press coverage probably next week about this. So we might go fairly low key this year, and then see, get our systems in place, and then go, take it a step further next year if we think it works. So if we're not getting good response from people, or if the logistics just can't be managed yet, then we might just keep it fairly low key. But we just think over time, we think it's a good way to go. But it'd be good to hear from others about whether they think that's a good idea or not. Getting the WI involved would be great. So I'm really keen to talk to you offline about that if that's possible.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You're on mute, Stuart.
Thank you, Brian. Pauline, you've got the regional structure within WI. What about doing a pilot region that's fairly close to home in Cheshire East and seeing how it works? Just my thoughts in response to that little discussion.
Well, the WI in Fulshore, where I am in Wilmslow, we already did plant 100 trees over with the, I might have been the National Trust, it might have been Mersey Forest, I don't know. We came over, we drove quite a long way, somebody else, and planted 100 trees. Don't know where it was.
Yeah, no, I think it was National. I remember that now. So I think it was National Trust.
Was it?
Yeah.
But it worked very well.
Yeah.
But we'll leave you two to liaise behind the scenes. Paddy, you want to ask?
Yeah, Paul, I mean, I think it's a great idea because or it's a great route through a fundamental problem, because we've all said, particularly schools and indeed private individuals with their kids like to plant the little trees. And then, of course, they want to bring them to a group like us and say, here, I've got all these things. And we all know it's a bit of a nightmare, because the problem for us is where to put them. I can provide lots and lots of saplings from my garden. The squirrels and jays do the job of planting them. So I think the other opportunity to test this is with a primary school or whatever. Yeah. And I can see it as being, look, we can grow these different things. The kids will absolutely love that. I mean, we all can all remember doing that sort of thing. But what we can offer them is, through this route, if you as a class produce 60 saplings, someone from the school, i.e. each kid grows 2, let's say, someone from the school with 1 or 2 kids can go along and get them all planted. They can be photographed, they can be registered where they are, because I think people want that as well. They want to know, I did my little bit of that forest. Yeah, I can't tell you exactly which tree it was. Yeah, one of those trees my kids planted or whatever. Yeah. And I just think that's a trial that, you know, we could probably get someone to set it up with the school. The issue is, again, you get back into Chris's favorite thing, right tree, right place. Yeah. You know, you'd have to tell us, or tell that school what it is you want. Yeah. And it could be, you say, we want everything. It's going to be a mixed woodland or this, that, and the other. But then the kids could grow them, and then there could be some, because taking 30 kids halfway across Cheshire to plant some trees, as Pauline says, it's a bit of a nightmare. But actually, if you take a few that could represent the class, take photographs and everything else, I think I would have thought a lot of primary schools, and indeed maybe secondary schools, would love the idea. Yeah, it does that link of, you're providing the place that these can go. Yeah, you know, that's the big problem we've always had. Saplings and that aren't the issue. It's where to put them. Yeah.
We have other questions coming in, but over to you, Paul, to just respond on that one.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think the difference for us is that we've got a longer term horizon of funding now to enable us to plan ahead for those sites and to acquire sites as well. So we're looking at, you know, some fairly large sites where to be acquired and then to be managed by, you know, third party potentially. So they're the sorts of sites where you can have, you know, 30, 40, 50, 100 hectares available for planting by community over time. It doesn't have to be all done by a contractor in one week or 1 month. It could be a 3-year program.
I certainly think it's something that is worth trialing with a school against some sort of criteria and seeing how they view it at the end of it. Yes, it worked, or no, it didn't. It was still a nightmare. Yeah. There are some people, we have dabbled in this before. So there are some people who are saying, we have done this, guys. So let's not forget the lessons from previous, which we won't. But it's not easy. But doesn't mean we oughtn't to do it. No, I totally agree. I think it's a great initiative.
We've got some other hands up. Can I roll on to a voice that kindly woke me up? Brian, Donahue, when I was on mute. Brian, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
I think I am muted. Can people hear me?
Yes, that's good.
Yeah. Okay. Paul, moving away from forests, I was interested to see on your diagram that you talked of hedgerows. If you come across a large area of land under different ownerships with depleted hedgerows, how would you go about a project like that? Where would the trees come from? How would you manage the different land ownerships and encourage people to put the right trees in the right places?
Yeah, so yeah, obviously we don't have any jurisdiction over those landowners, so it all comes from them as a voluntary on their part. So they have to want to get involved. Normally, it would be the case that an interested landowner would contact us. They would talk about, you know, maybe some woodland planting, and then we would say, what about hedgerows? Because hedgerows traditionally, as you probably know, have been quite difficult to fund. So the fact that we've got some funding to do that is great, particularly in the Cheshire landscape context. And what we tend to find is that once we work with a landowner, either they tell their neighbours or the neighbours see what's happening, and we start to get approached by the neighbours. If we saw some amazing opportunities, my colleagues would go knocking on doors or trying to find out whose land it was, because it makes sense to try to do as much as we could in a particular location whilst we're there. And the way that schemes are delivered varies by landowners also. Some landowners do the schemes themselves, so we would provide the funding to a landowner, and she or he would then either get them planted themselves with farm staff or others, or get a contractor in, or sometimes we'll help the landowner or landowners to get a contractor to get the trees planted. If it's a very small scale scheme like the one that Pauline was talking about at Dunham, it may well be that there are community groups who come in to help to plant the hedgerow and the trees. So it's really, in some ways, it's complicated because there's no simple answer to say, yeah, it's 1 + 1 + 1 sort of thing. But we'll work with the landowner or landowners in any which way to try to get schemes delivered.
Okay, it's not as fruitful as a big area of land in which you can say we're going to plant thousands of trees.
Yeah.
But that still interests you, and there's still effort and money available to do it.
Yeah,
is there?
There's effort and money. I think you are right. You know, we are challenged by government to deliver some challenging targets. Use challenge twice in one sentence. So we do have to make sure that we are directing most of our effort to hitting those targets. But again, you all know better than me. You know, the Cheshire landscape is a landscape of hedgerows and hedgerow trees. So the Mersey Forest plan was written as a response to degraded landscape. So lots of our policies within the Mersey Forest plan talks about trying to enhance, improve the hedgerow landscape of Cheshire. So so the answer is a very long way to say yes. We do try to spend effort. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. That's great. Pippa, would you like to come in next?
Well, I think Anthony had a question, and I had
Anthony. Oh, sorry, it's your title on the Zoom. So Anthony.
Okay. Well, I didn't really want to butt in there, but thank you. Brilliant talk. So optimistic as well. Just a few related things. With hedgerows, could you just encourage farmers to let them grow higher? And would that be quite a quick win if you had hedgerows twice the height? And secondly, related to that, I'm aware of the fact Cheshire East own a lot of farmland. And a lot of that, I'm sure you're probably in discussion with them, but I'm aware that a lot of that's quite small farms. And is there a way forward moving towards sort of community farms where, planting forests was part of that activity?
Yeah, so the first one, I think we would encourage farmers to do you described, so to allow the hedgerows to grow larger and wilder. Whether they listen to us is another matter altogether. So I'd say they probably don't listen to us about that. The second point about Cheshire East land holding, definitely in play at the minute. So loads of conversations going on with Cheshire East about their ambitious plans for being net zero and how they inset plants, or how they offset their carbon emissions on their own land. So some of the things you described are being discussed at the moment.
I mean, there's just one example in Wilmslow. There's a farm just next door to the prison, where some of it's not bad land, but
Yeah.
there's a whole load of land down by the river which regularly gets flooded, and
Yeah.
that could all be wonderful wooded area along the river.
Yeah, wet woodlands, maybe helping to reduce flood risk further downstream, potentially, riparian woodland. And one of the challenges, obviously, is, and we are starting to feel it a little bit, some landowners suggesting that no trees should be planted on farmland at the moment because of food security issues. So most of Cheshire is grade 3 agricultural land, so it's not the best, most versatile land. But still, we're getting some pushback saying, what about, have you thought about food security? So we obviously have thought about food security. We don't have an answer always, but what we're doing is point something of a percentage of land use change across the country. So we're not really going to be having a major impact on food security, for which there is a whole other discussion which you might be having at another time around the move from the way we farm and how and what we eat and what we grow and all those sorts of things. But they have much bigger implications on food security than what we do.
John, did you want to come in again? John, you got your hand up?
John's on mute.
No.
Yes. So yes, please. So
Let's go over to you.
But only I'd be happy to come in once others have had their say.
Right.
There's so much one could talk about, but I wanted to just ask a few things. First of all, did I hear it right that not only was Cheshire East top of the league in the local authorities of the Mersey Forest for planting, but actually one of the local authorities in England, one of the top local authorities in England? That was the first question.
Yeah, so of the 76 local authorities in the community forests, Cheshire East was the top.
Wow.
We think that might also mean it's the top authority in the country. We haven't got that stat yet though, so it's definitely the top of the 76 in the community forests.
So it's gone from sort of 0 to hero. That's absolutely amazing.
Yeah, very good.
And how has that been achieved, Paul?
I think by having a good plan. So Cheshire East has got, I think, as you know, so Brendan, and you know Brendan well, Brendan has developed a good plan. I think it's also the case that because Cheshire East hasn't been in the Mersey Forest, lots of the, Florence talked about fruit trees, lots of the low-hanging fruit in Cheshire East is still ripe. So lots of the easy wins in St Helens or Warrington have gone. In Cheshire East, there's still quite a lot of low-hanging fruit to go at. So I think we need to be mindful that we've stepped into a place where there hasn't been lots of resource gone in for tree planting in the last 20 years, and maybe brought some of those sites forward quite quickly.
I think,
Paul, can I just come in there? The reason why I suspect John is asking, and all of us, our perception at a local small scale level is that Cheshire East have been very difficult to engage with and to partner with, although we offer our services and everything else. So I'm delighted that they've achieved this change.
Yeah.
The thing for us, it's not something to fix tonight sort of thing, but we desperately want to work closer with them and to help them and for them to help us.
Yeah.
And having the right links to the right people, because clearly to have achieved that, they must have some desire and some momentum to do it.
Yeah.
So you may be able to help us get those right contacts. Because if you started this talk by just asking, what does everyone in this group think of Cheshire East and their involvement and their proactivity, I suspect you would have got a very damning bit of feedback. Now, therefore, how do we change that?
Yeah.
And how do we work with them? We're desperate to work with them.
Yeah.
Because,
interesting.
Yeah. So it's a point for another, another talk or whatever. But we're we want to get those relationships and those contacts. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
An example of very positive working has been that We've had over the last 2 years Jonathan Price very much leading the way in the work of the tree group, and he is a very imaginative landscape designer, and he's been working with ANSA, who are the people who manage the parks in Wilmslow, and has been coming up with some really superb schemes, both for planting small trees, whips, but also planting standard trees. And I reckon that the planting that's taken place in parks in Wilmslow in the last year is the most significant planting that has happened in our area since the Second World War.
Wow.
In the parkland landscapes.
Yeah.
And the planting was done really expertly as well by the ANSA workforce, so that I've been monitoring the trees very carefully in my area, in our area, and they have all survived the drought. I think Denise was saying that that's not necessarily the case in Handforth, but it's just amazing to see how these trees manage to cope. And come through. These are big heavy standards in the parks, and on doubling up, and really thinking ahead, sort of taking one area called the Pleasure, where there's a magnificent line of going through a right angle of mature lime trees, and then planting a series of lime trees in parallel with that to provide long-term succession. It's really great, actually, to see what can be done.
Definitely. And I think that what we have to keep pushing for is, I mentioned it earlier, that the resources that have been provided nationally by government to do this, or don't just turn off in a couple of years' time. So, the people like ANSA will continue to do that sort of work, provided they can see a flow of money coming in the future. So they've I suppose turned around their thinking about trees and planting quite considerably, as you just described. But what we need to do is make sure that they can see that there's a long-term need for them to continue to invest in the sorts of people and the training of their staff to enable them to plant really well, so that the survival rate is as high as you described.
Pippa and Anthony, your hands up again. Do you want to come back in?
I just wanted to talk a bit more about trees within towns, because you've been talking about planting in big areas of land, which is obviously really important, but also in terms of planting in towns, in terms of climate mitigation and so on. And John and Paddy have described how the tree group have worked with ANSA and got this trees in parks. But we see a lot of trees coming down and being allowed to do so by planning applications. So the planning department don't seem to have spoken to the tree planting department, because you may be planting a lot of trees, but an awful lot of trees are coming down, and planning departments are allowing. For example, there was one planning application that was for a house just on the edge of Lindo Common, and they were basically going to get rid of a whole load of trees and basically turn it into a car park, and that got planning permission. So we're seeing a lot of trees going, and we're seeing, one of the things John often talks about is front gardens. We're seeing a lot of gardens going to tarmac for car parks, but then also Paddy's raised the issue of replacement trees. So Cheshire East had a tree cutting down strategy, but didn't have a tree replacement strategy. And that still, I don't think, has ever happened. When you want to look at new street trees, then the highways department will tell you that that's really not allowed, because you don't know what services are under there, and anyway, the cars might not be able to see around the corner or whatever. So we get quite a lot of, on the Transition Wilmslow email, I get a number of queries from people saying, my street would love to have more trees down our street, or we'd love to have a few trees here or whatever. And you can't do that, because you can't plant of land. And then the other thing is people's gardens, that loads of people are cutting down trees, and you know, some of the street treescapes are disappearing. So it's just really, how do you make that kind of forest mentality go to all the departments? Council.
So highways in Cheshire East, I think, is particularly challenging. So I think be diplomatic. Other highways departments we've got better relationships with. I think trees and highways across the country, I don't think it's just Cheshire East. I think generally it's trees are seen definitely as a liability, and that they're something that probably most highway departments would prefer not to have to deal with. I don't know that, I've not spoken to them all, but that's the impression I get, personal view, etc., etc. But we have had some really good relationships, in particular with Wirral and with Liverpool. So the number of huge urban trees gone into the Strand in Liverpool, along past Liverpool 1 up into the Fabric District. There are the streetscapes there have been transformed with trees and cycleways and other things. So it can be done, and the engineers do know what to do and can be converted, but it takes time and it's expensive. So some of the trees that we've been planting in Stafford Street, which is in the Fabric District, so down near Islington in Liverpool, they were about £12,000 each. So each tree was £12,000, and we can plant a hectare of woodland for less than that. And that cost, the tree cost £800. So everything else was the engineering underground. So there was, as you can imagine, in a city like Liverpool, an old city, we were coming across all sorts of stuff that wasn't documented, illegal connections, going back 120, 130 years that weren't mapped. So the poor contractor was having to work around all of that, plus comply with all of the highway regulations to make sure that as the trees went in, they weren't going to cause a hazard in the future to the highway at all. So planting trees in towns is really important, but it's really hard. We need to do more of it, and the Mersey Forest is, we do lots. We could do more, but it is hard. So I don't have an answer. I think it is probably this idea about people power. People have got to ask for it. How do we let people know that chopping trees down in their garden is maybe not the best thing to do, because it is providing shade. We try to use the argument about loss of house value as you lose the treescape as well in urban areas. So the valuation office suggests that between, I think it's 3 and 7% of your property value is determined by the quality of the treescape. So chop down all the trees and you potentially drop your house price by 7%. That might make some people think at least twice, maybe, about whether all those trees ought to come down, or whether they should be arguing for them to go up. So actually, for more trees to be planted, because that creates a higher house price. All sorts of other discussions about that, whether that's a good thing to do, gentrification, blah blah blah. But it's something we have tried to use, where we've tried to persuade people that cutting down all the trees isn't a great idea.
Partly because trees are not necessarily, the right tree isn't necessarily planted in the right place, and also because of tree diseases and so on. Inevitably, there is quite a big churn in the urban forest, in the trees within the built-up area, and that's always going to happen. And someone like Chris Franklin, who's with us, is dealing with that sort of issue all the time. So we're always going to, if we think of the urban forest, if we think of the trees in the town as an urban forest, which is producing a crop, I mean a substantial crop really every year. The question is, what then happens to that wood or the timber that's being produced? Now, one possible solution, which Chris is pioneering, is actually, and he can talk about, is using that timber properly in a creative way, actually making use of it as a resource. There is also a kind of another solution, which is to gather all the timber into one place and then transport it across to Drax and use it for generating electricity as biomass. And I wondered what your thoughts are about this. And I think Chris himself might want to contribute to this discussion, because I know it's something he's passionate about.
Yeah, so I'd agree definitely with the idea of making sure that we use the crop, let's call it that, to best effect. And long-term use in the way that Chris does is, I think, top of the list of ways we ought to do that. So finding ways to give it a good home for the long term obviously locks up the carbon for a very, very long time. If that can't be done, potentially biomass and mulch is second and third in the list of things to do. Obviously, just putting it to landfill is the least best thing we should be doing. So I'm hoping that doesn't happen too often anymore, but I think it probably still does happen.
Do we have any idea how much sort of tonnage is going from the towns and cities in the Mersey Forest for power generation?
No, and it doesn't have to go to Drax anymore. Obviously, we've got, well, not obviously, there is a biomass plant at Widnes as well that takes local produce. So Stobart have deals with many of the local authorities for their wood waste to go to that plant. But we don't have the don't have the tonnage.
Chris, do you want to come back on any of that? I mean, we're very familiar, but is there anything you want to add?
Where do I start? As those of you who know me, I'm a passionate believer in that we should be using more of our urban timber as a crop, as a harvest. And even today, somebody said it's nice that you're recycling, and we're not recycling at all, we're harvesting. It's some of the best timber there is for interest, because most of the trees we take down are full of stain from diseases, and the stain is beautiful artwork. But going back to what John's saying about Drax and whatever, the one good thing that's happened recently from that dreaded term targets is that the biomass power stations have got to reach certain targets of how much biomass they process. And there's hardly any tree contractors, I wouldn't have thought, in the country that don't end up having their what they consider waste going to the power stations. When it comes down to quantities, my feeling is that one of the collection points is just down the lane from me. And if you want to see tree contractors going past just down a certain lane, there's probably, you'll see 20, maybe 30 a day. And I reckon that if you follow that through, we're throwing away something like 1,000 to 5,000 tons of usable urban timber every single day, which may seem horrific, but the problem with it is what we found is the biggest challenge is planning laws, because you can't process timber in an agricultural environment because the processing of that timber is considered industrial, but you couldn't possibly store the timber for the time that's required for it and in an industrial estate, because it's difficult to make it pay anyway, let alone paying rent on an industrial estate. So until we can get those that make decisions start looking again at the common agricultural policy and things like that, then I don't see that's going to change. We're very fortunate because we can process much of it in our own back garden, but that's because we managed to buy half an acre of field and it's now garden, so that means we can do it, which is crazy. So in other words, you can do it if you break the law for a short term, and then you get grandfather rights, which is just crazy. So there is, I think there's huge opportunities for connection and stuff like that, and we're really enjoying the challenge, and we get ridiculous benefits ourselves. The commercial side of it is still a little bit uncertain, but hopefully it'll start to pay back soon, and we need that because a business and a process is not sustainable if it's not financially sustainable. So that's our challenge at the moment.
That, Chris, leads very nicely into the question from Jean, because Jean monitors planning applications for Transition Wilmslow, and the loss of trees in gardens is a really regular issue in planning applications. Is there some strategy that those of us who are active in monitoring applications can follow to fight for the preservation of trees?
There isn't. There is no requirement to have, there are no, Chris's word, target. There are no targets for urban tree cover. There are, unless it's TPO'd or conservation area, there is no protection on many of the trees. I think it's a, in terms of, getting to net zero, tackling climate change, all those other things we want to do, it's a glaring hole in our policy, I think. But I also think that restriction on activity in private residences is going to be quite a challenge to get through at the moment, given where we think planning is going with less regulation. Putting more restrictions on just might be a massive challenge. Again, John might have ideas about that, but which is where, this is me being completely utopian, which is where the idea that getting information out to people about why the trees should stay and why more should be planted is maybe the way to go, rather than just restricting, saying to people you can't do things. It's how do we, and it can't be just Mersey Forest, it's got to be a massive movement of people just trying to get more understanding about why we need to do these things ourselves, rather than waiting for laws or regs to do it.
Yeah. Pauline has a hand up, but before that, I'll just try and be a little clever, because we've had a nice lead from Flo. If I just share this. Flo, would you like to just talk to that image? Can everyone see that?
Yes, totally. Thanks so much, Paul. This is some cedar cladding that we've had put on wood fibre insulation. So somewhere, probably not in the UK, the wood fibre has been processed, but this is the kind of thing that we could be doing with waste wood. But Chris's cedar has gone on as the rain screen on the bottom section there, and up the top. He's also provided us with window boards, solid cedar window boards, which are absolutely beautiful. And as part of this festival, we've got the Green Homes tour, so people can actually come and see and feel and smell it. It's absolutely heavenly. So yeah, so we're really excited about that. So thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Flo, for thinking of sharing that with us. Practical use and practical interest. Tell me, what time is it in Cairo? Are you an hour ahead?
Hour ahead, yeah.
Yes. Well, that's all right. but I'm sure you'll be quite relieved when we can wind things down a little bit for you. I hope you had a meal before you started and that you're not fainting from hunger. That's good. Have we got a last question for Paul tonight?
Denise has got her hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Carry on.
Yeah, I just really wanted to draw attention to the area called Hanforth East, opposite the shopping centre at Hanforth Dean, which is designated for redevelopment by Cheshire East, and it's land owned by Cheshire East. There's a huge area there which has rewilded over the years since the Second World War, and there is going to be a huge amount of tree loss, with the proposed development there. There's also areas around the actual Handforth Dean shopping centre which has rewilded, and that's all being cleared as well. The trees, I would be quite surprised if if Cheshire East is planting anything like the number of trees that are disappearing in these areas.
Yeah.
And it's just so discouraging, really, to see how much things have changed around Handforth in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
Well, it's been wonderful to hear Paul's counter argument to that Cheshire East is planting a lot, Denise, and maybe it's up to us as lobbyists to try and do more with our Cheshire East councillors and hopefully get them to listen somewhat more.
Yeah, but I'm always happy to feed that in to say, because the inset policy for Cheshire East, I think is a good policy, but I'm not sure it takes account of loss.
Yeah. Yeah. Another thing to take home from tonight. We're giving you a fairly good list to follow up on, aren't we?
Yeah, thank you.
Paddy, would you like to just round off the evening, unmute yourself and just have a nice rounding off of the evening's discussion? Paddy, did you pick that up? And if you'd like to unmute, that's great. And I'll leave it to you to say thank you formally to our speaker.
Yeah, Paul, I think I found it really interesting, and I've written an awful lot of sort of scribbled notes down. And in particular, I don't know about the others, but the thing, the slide that you used that made me really sort of, that's spot on, was the one about hope. Okay, it reminded me of the, the infamous sort of story that everyone tells about the small lad on the beach who sees all the stranded starfish, and there's thousands of them, and he's throwing them back one by one, and someone approaches him and says, look, you can't fix this, there's thousands of them, and he picks another one up and throws it in and says, well, I made a difference to that one. Now, the point I'm trying to say with the whole hope thing is in this modern world, I think a lot of us feel often quite hopeless. But every time I plant a bloody tree, I feel a little bit better. And that slide I thought was particularly useful, because if we can capture that with a lot more people, because there's an awful lot of hopelessness out there, then I think we can mobilize an awful lot of people. So thank you in particular for that slide, because it certainly made me feel better. Across the country, and I don't think any more so than in the Northwest, there are groups like ours, the Transition Wilmslow Tree Group, who are trying to bring about increases to our local tree cover. Your talk, though, gives this work a sort of regional and indeed national context, so that we can all see how the small bricks that we're trying to work on make up the bigger picture that we all want so much. And I think what's critical is that we help you, and I think you can help us. And if we can get that working right, then the grassroots can be adding to what you're doing, and you can help the grassroots as well. So I think it's all very positive stuff. I for one take real heart knowing that the regional and national scene is being managed by people like yourself. I think it's impressive, and I think it gives us a real hope for the future. So on behalf of everyone that's listened this evening, I'd like to thank you for the uplifting talk, and I'm sure everyone will want to join in with thank you in the usual way with a round of applause. Thanks very much.
Unmute.
Thank you, Paddy.
Well done. Thank you,
all.
Paddy, and thank you all for coming. Now, next week we've got Anna Gilchrist, and we're looking at the, if I read it, the denatured landscape, the shifting baselines of Linder Moss, and that links in with one of the talks, one of the walks as well. So we're doing talks and walks. Don't forget to check the Festival of Nature website and keep open the street festival on Sunday the 25th. With lots going on. And thank you. We'll say good night, everyone, and good night to Cairo, with special thanks when you're on holidays. Well done. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks again.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, all.
Bye.